What's an NSFW scandal in your family? My dad cheated on my mom with her best friend, so they divorced. Then my dad proceeded to date the woman he cheated with for 4 years, but then they break up. Then the woman marries my dad's best friend. Dad meets a new woman, and now the two couples are best friends and swing together. Meanwhile, my mom committed suicide. My aunt was a hoarder and none of us had ever been in her house. We had suspected for years that she was a lesbian, but it was never confirmed. This was my grandfather's sister, so she was born around 1913. They were also very Southern and very Baptist. Not exactly a coming-out friendly generation or environment. She was more than a little bit weird, but in a fun way. She was always hilarious to be around and would crack jokes that made other family members clutch their pearls. She was a world traveler with her friend and never had kids. Her friend, who we also never met, was her sole beneficiary, along with a cat rescue. It was always sad to us that she never felt comfortable sharing her life with us. But I think that generation just never really felt comfortable. She died very unexpectedly after falling in the shower in the early 90s, and my mom and some of her cousins went to clean her home out. While they were there, they were going through pictures to figure out which ones her siblings might want, and came across thousands of pictures of penises. Not real-life ones, but zoomed-in ones from statues, paintings, etc., all from around the world. My aunt had zoomed into just the penis on all the art. They could find no other pictures of the full piece of art. So for instance, there was the David, but only his penis. No picture of the whole statue in its entirety that they could find. My mom and her cousins spent a full day having so much fun, laughing their asses off, drinking wine, and trying to figure out what piece of art around the world that penis belonged to. This was pre-Google, so they had to try and do it from memory. One of the cousins still has the photos and has apparently turned it into a board game of sorts that she plays with friends. My grandfather was murdered decades ago. The cops knew who did it, but they could never find the guy. My mom is the youngest of 7, and she was always close to this brother. She said she always felt safe around him. He was a steel worker and would cuss like a sailor, but he was always a softie around us kids. Family was important to him. On his deathbed in the hospital, he asked my mom to come closer and told the rest of us to leave the room. My dad took us out of the room, and we waited in the hall. My mom comes out crying and pale as a sheet. My father grabs her and asks her what's wrong. She whispers something into his ear, and my dad loses all color in his face and runs down the hall to a phone. This was way before cell phones. I looked in at my uncle, who was still alive. He just smiled at me and laid there. My uncle was 19 when my grandfather was murdered, and he knew who the guy was that killed my grandfather. So he found him the same night and killed him. He buried the body in the woods on family land and never told a soul until he knew he was going to die himself. My dad and mom called the police, but my uncle died before they got there. Later, they dug in the spot he told my mom, and they found a skeleton. My mom and dad never talked about it again, and they would get pissed if my brothers or sister would bring it up. My parents are both gone now, as are all of her siblings. We cousins never talk about it. His daughters deny it totally, even after hearing that I still loved my uncle and never thought any different of him. My great-grandmother left my great-grandfather after they had 2 kids because she didn't like being a mom. While she was gone, she literally started working in a whorehouse. A little under 2 years after she left, she came back and dropped off a kid for my great-grandfather to take care of. 6 years after that, she came back, took my great-aunt, and gave her to her biological father. I believe a year after that, she came back and decided she was ready to be a mother to my grandmother and great-aunt. My great-grandfather and her were together for the rest of their lives. He took care of her when she was deathly ill to the day she died, over 40 years later. My second great-aunt tracked down my great-grandfather in her early 20s and short-lived the rest of her life like she had 2 fathers. Needless to say that family gatherings could be tense at times. Not sure if it's really NSFW, but I had an uncle, let's call him Ralph. Now Ralph was married to Alice. They were extremely toxic together. They got drunk and literally got into physical fights with each other. One day Ralph posts on social media how sad he is that Alice finally left him, yada yada. No surprise there, and often other members of the family would say, "Oh yay, we saw Aunt Alice at the Piggly Wiggly. She's a teacher in another state now." So we all thought that's what happened because there were these constant sightings of Aunt Alice. Fast forward 7-ish years later, and Uncle Ralph is diagnosed with stage 3 lung cancer. He was a chronic smoker, so no surprise there. They did all they could to save him and finally told him they would be surprised if he survived another month or so. He called a family meeting for a final goodbye, and that's when he admits to everyone, and I mean the whole family was packed into this guy's hospital room, including a 13-year-old stormtrooper Bob. Anyway, he admits that 7-ish years ago he murdered Aunt Alice, buried her body in the woods where he liked to hunt, and that was that. He passed the following week. The police did find the remains and Aunt Alice was put to rest. That's my family scandal in a nutshell. My hyper-religious, super-conservative godfather, 75 million, is a doctor. He worked as a gyno in a public hospital geared towards those in need. He had a child out of wedlock with one of his patients. Apparently, though highly unethical, there was no abuse involved and the mother actually wanted him, and they proceeded to have a whole affair during her doc apps, which became increasingly frequent. The family found out when the child was already in her teens. My godmother was suspicious about a few monthly expenses that seemed to be increasing and decided to investigate, follow the money. He was paying a buttload of child support, shut up money. She was, of course, devastated. His son-in-law, 50 million, who saw him as this inspirational alpha father leader man of God figure and always wanted to follow his lead, legitimately had a mental breakdown when everyone found out and ended up in a psych ward for 3 months. My cousin, at time in her 20s, married a guy in his 40s who came with an adult kid, a son, 18 at the time, from a previous relationship. My cousin pumped out a couple kids with this man. Couple years pass, my cousin is caught in bed with her husband's adult son, now in his mid-20s, while my cousin was in her 30s. Cousin and husband divorce. Cousin keeps custody of their children. Cousin keeps seeing the adult son of her ex-husband. Couple years pass, they pump out a few kids. The dude is now a stepfather to his own half-siblings, and his own biological kids are half-siblings to his own half-siblings. We don't talk about my cousin anymore. My great-aunt was married 5 times. Each of the first 4 died from various causes: car accident, heart attack, injury while working on their property, unknown cause in his sleep. The 5th committed suicide. The whole family believes she somehow directly or indirectly killed each of them in turn. I only knew her when I was a little kid, but she was certainly bitter and mean-spirited. My aunt's ex-husband raped my cousins, his daughters, yes, multiple, when they were young and did it for years. This obviously fucked up his daughters. I remember one day as a kid watching America's Most Wanted or Most Wanted, and at the end of the show, they always showed a snippet for who the FBI was currently looking for. Well, my mom was watching it, and at that snippet, we saw my cousin's name being wanted for endangering children. Also have a cousin who committed premeditated murder on her own husband. This was only 2 years ago. My aunt divorced her husband. When I was young, I was told it's because he cheated on her. A couple years ago, I learned that wasn't the whole truth. My aunt came home one day and found him with her teenage daughter, his stepdaughter, lounging in the bedroom, sharing a joint, in nothing but their underwear. Because this all happened before I was born, I didn't even know I had an extra cousin on that side of the family. My 2 first cousins had a kid together after a drunken encounter in high school. This was approximately 25 years ago. Kid turned out perfectly normal. They didn't have any more children, but they did end up raising the kid together as a normal family and are basically married. We don't really talk about it. Not me, but my friend. His dad fucked his girlfriend and got caught by his mother. They got divorced. My friend got back together with his girlfriend, married her, and got her pregnant. Since then, he never spoke with his dad again. Never understood how he could forgive his girlfriend, but not his dad. I was at a friend's wedding. Father of the groom was a bit of a dodgy fella and was known to do a bit of cocaine. At this wedding, he was caught coming out of the small bathrooms that was in this mega stately home where the wedding was. But he wasn't alone. He exited with a young girl in her teens. The teen girl's dad caught them coming out, and as you can imagine, it all kicked off. He had to come clean that nothing was happening, but they were just sharing a line. Is that a lesser evil? My cousin and her husband, in their 50s, got really sick by a mysterious illness. Doctors couldn't diagnose anything, but it looked like liver failure, so they were told to quit drinking, and they did. 5 months later, my cousin died. 1 month exactly later, her husband dies too. They had kids in their 20s living in the same house. Mother and I went over to collect some bits and offer support. Antifreeze in the kitchen, funnel and antifreeze in the bathroom, near an empty medicine bottle. My dad and I are certain they killed their parents. They never even seemed to care their parents died. Since then, they moved away and don't talk to anyone in the family anymore. My mother was molested by her sister's husband. Her sister found out and shot him. She got out of prison on my birth year. Then when she found out I had been raped, she went and threatened the man with a gun. He died in a car crash a couple of years later. Police suspect foul play since the car was lit on fire. Love you, Auntie Carol. It's 1970, and I'm probably 6 or 7 years old at the time. Just came home from first grade and was watching television when one of my aunts came home and told me to turn off the television and go upstairs. It was only later that day that I learned the news. My grandfather, who had a massive drinking problem, had been in a one-car accident with my 3 younger siblings. None of the kids were wearing belts or restraints. My youngest brother went through the car windshield, suffered tremendous skull and brain damage, and lived barely another 6 months before God called him home. For some reason, my baby brother was buried without a tombstone, and the rest of the family basically rallied around my grandfather, declaring that he made a horrible mistake in judgment, but that he was still a good man. First grade me couldn't figure any of that out. First grade me was still wondering why my brother wasn't home from the hospital the way my other brother and sister were able to come home. 40 years later, adult me tried to rectify the situation by paying out of my pocket for my brother's grave marker. With the help of the cemetery office, I was able to get a marker installed in 2010. The NSFW part was that in doing so, my extended family members accused me of ripping open old wounds, that for what my grandfather did was just a mistake, an accident, an error, and that my baby brother is now just an angel floating around in heaven. Even to this day, I will not drink 1 drop of beer or alcohol, and I've cut myself off from the rest of my family for good. As far as I'm concerned, if they believe that my brother is in heaven after what happened to him, they can all go to hell.